This is my jalapeno cheddar sourdough bread, except this time instead of using mild yellow cheddar cheese, I used extra sharp white cheddar cheese, which made the bread a little bit tangier, but it was still smoky and spicy from those fresh diced jalapenos. To make this bread, I started out with 300 grams of water, then I added 100 grams of active and risen sourdough starter. Then I sprinkled in 10 grams of kosher salt and I gave everything a stir to dissolve the starter and the salt into the water. Then I added 50 grams of whole wheat flour and 400 grams of plain white bread flour. Then I mixed the ingredients together for about a minute until the dough started to hold together. Then I covered the dough up and let it rest for 30 minutes. Then a half hour later, I uncovered the dough and gave it its first set of stretch and folds, stretching and folding each of the four corners of the dough, and then I covered the dough up again and let it rest for another 30 minutes. During that time, I got out 1 jalapeno and 8 ounces of extra sharp white cheddar cheese. I removed the seeds and then diced the jalapeno and cut up the cheddar into small cubes. After a 30-minute rest, it was time to add the cheddar and jalapenos to the dough. So I flattened the dough a little bit, then added half of the jalapenos and half of the cheddar cheese directly on top of the dough, pressed it down so that the ingredients would stick to the dough, and then I did 4 more stretches and folds, stretching and folding each of the 4 corners of the dough. Then I covered up the dough and gave it one more 30-minute rest, and after those 30 minutes, I flattened the top again and added the remainder of the jalapenos and cheddar cheese. I pressed those down so they would stick, and I gave the dough one more set of stretches and folds, stretching and folding the 4 corners of the dough. Now the jalapenos and cheese were distributed throughout the dough in layers. At this point, I covered the dough with a damp kitchen towel and let it rise for 5 hours at room temperature. After 5 hours, it had doubled in size and it was puffy and ready to shape. So I took the dough out of the bowl and placed it on my unfloured countertop and gently pre-shaped it into a ball to give it some structure. Then I let the dough rest uncovered on the counter for another 30 minutes. At that point, it was time to give the dough its final shape as an oval, so I put a little bit of flour on top of the dough and flipped it over. Now this is a relatively easy shaping method to shape the dough as an oval. I picked the dough up and I folded it in half like a book, and then I pinched the seam closed. Then I gave the dough a 90-degree turn, and I folded it in half like a book again, and I pinched the seam closed again. Then I placed the dough upside down into a floured banneton basket, and I covered it up and let it rest and rise on the counter at room temperature for 2 hours. 2 hours later, the dough was risen, puffy, fully proofed, and ready to bake. So I flipped it out onto a sheet of parchment paper and scored it with a razor blade in one long slash right across the top of the dough. Then I transferred the dough, parchment paper and all, into my preheated Dutch oven, and I popped the lid on to trap the steam. Then I baked the bread for 20 minutes at 450 degrees Fahrenheit, removed the lid, admired my oven spring, and baked it for an additional 15 minutes without the lid. The bread came out looking golden brown and beautiful with these delicious looking white cheddar cheese pockets in the crumb. The sharp cheese made this bread tangy, and the jalapenos were still spicy and a little bit sweet. This bread will be delicious no matter what type of cheddar cheese you decide to use.